Hello and a warm welcome to all our online viewers to Friends of Europe's Strategic Conversation series. Today, we're going to be focused on gender. What does it mean to have a gender-focused recovery post the pandemic? I'm joined today by two very significant women who've been involved in various ways on this agenda through their particular roles. Today, I'm joined by Nahla Valji, who is a senior advisor to the Secretary General at NATO, and also Margo Thomas, who is founder and CEO of the Women's Economic Imperative. This is a timely debate, as it ever will be. We all know what's happened in terms of inequalities as a consequence of the virus crisis. We have read reams about what's happened to minority groups and those who are already disadvantaged. But what we want to talk about today is, what do we do about gender equality? The Financial Times recently reported that the virus crisis is likely to wipe out all the gender equality gains that we've made over the past 2 or 3 decades. We also know that it's had an insidious impact on women's safety. The lockdown in particular has given rise to phenomenal rates of domestic violence. So today we want to discuss what does gender-focused recovery of the pandemic mean? And so the question I want to pose to our two powerful women is, what does building back better mean in terms of women's equality? What does it mean in real terms? So Nahla, I'd like to start with you.
Great. Dharmendra, thank you so much. And thank you for the invitation to be here today. Maybe just to correct you before I begin, to say Senior Gender Advisor to the SG for the UN, not for NATO. I think I would come with a slightly different perspective if I was—
My bad, sorry.
From NATO, no, not at all. So let me just begin by saying, and I think as you framed it, Dharmendra, this has been a crisis and a pandemic that has exacerbated existing gender inequalities, but that has also had the impacts that it has had because of existing inequalities, and the most pervasive of those being gender inequality. And we've seen the crisis impact economically on women. Women are already, because of a lifetime of inequality, they have less savings, they're in less secure jobs, they are likely to be less economically well off. And so when an economic crisis such as the one that we're experiencing at the moment hits, they are the ones who are already closest to poverty and likely to be pulled back into poverty or in fact extreme poverty. The sectors that have been hit are disproportionately employing women, and so women have been the first to be laid off, the last to be taken back. You layer on top of that existing biases about women in the workforce, and we already have economists labeling this a she-cession, that this has impacted women disproportionately and in a much different way than past recessions and depressions have impacted women. This is also connected to the issue of unpaid care work, which I'll come back to in a moment when we talk about how we recover better. Women have had to absorb the shift. You know, when we say that economies have shut down, it's not that work has stopped. Much of that work has shifted into the home, and taking hours out of women's days where they're trying to juggle their work situation, as well as increased elder care, school and childcare. As well as healthcare in the home. And then, of course, the issue of violence that you mentioned. So in all of these ways, the impact on women has been significant. And the pandemic has had the extreme impacts that it's had globally because of the existing inequalities. And I think, as the Secretary General says, if we had been further along in implementing the Sustainable Development Goals, we would not be experiencing the kinds of impacts of this crisis that we are at the moment. And so it requires us to double down on the frameworks that we have, and that is the Sustainable Development Goals, which includes a dedicated goal on gender equality, that includes the Paris Agreement on climate change, because we need to build back from this with more inclusive, green, resilient, gender equal societies if we are to be able to foolproof ourselves from pandemics and crises like this in the future. So what does that mean? It means returning to our global agreements on the Sustainable Development Goals. It means investing in those goals, in equal access to health, education,
okay.
Water, sanitation, etc. And it also means, and let me leave it here and come back, I think, a little bit later on the issues of violence and leadership, but just to say, it also requires us to rethink the piece on the care economy. And how that fits in our macroeconomic and our global financial frameworks. The care economy, the unpaid value of women's work, or the underpaid value of women's work, is crucial to the inequalities that we see in this moment. But let me leave it there.
No, thank you for that. One of the things that you might want to think on, come back to in the conversation, is what we do know is that performance against the SDGs is very poor across the world. There isn't a framework that's actually making this work in the way that we all hoped for, had the ambition for such a global historic agreement. But let's think about that, whether when we double down on those frameworks, what does that actually mean in real terms to actually make it happen? Margo, I want to turn to you. What does building back better mean for gender equality?
I would like to actually reframe that question and put gender equality in the context of the well-being of every human being on this earth. The reason why we're talking about gender equality, we need to recognize that everyone benefits at the end of the day. And invariably, when we talk about women, we're talking about women and children and the impacts on this very significant portion of society when we look at the social and economic impact that has emerged or has been exacerbated by the COVID-19 crisis. So for me, building back better, we need to go to that starting point where we acknowledge the value of every single human being. And that allows us then to understand why women, half of the world's population, to the extent that we undervalue and diminish their voice and their agency across our cultural, political, social, and economic systems, we all lose. I think if we can get to that starting point, then to Nahla's point, we can then say, now we need to start focusing on the existing frameworks. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. In fact, we don't have time to do that. This is an all hands on deck moment. The third point that I would make, and we will come to it on the leadership and violence and some of the other subtopics, we focus on the care economy, but we also need to recognize that women contribute economically in ways that are significantly undervalued. And that is not reflected in the GDP. Indeed. The World Bank has produced an estimate of the value lost due to the the diminished contribution of human capital by women. And their estimate, if I'm not mistaken, haven't looked at it recently, was something in the order of $160 trillion per year. So this is very significant. And I think we need to look at it from that perspective, because we need to understand that we are all mutually vulnerable.
Indeed, and you make that point about the fact this is about common shared goods and a common shared sense of values about all of us and our society as a whole. But if money matters and the economy matters and economics matters fundamentally in this, and as you say, the economic devaluation and absolute ignoring the contribution of women's contribution to our societies, is gender proofing GDP a route out of this? Is that what we should be looking for? Nahla, I'll start with you first.
Great, thanks. You know, I'm not so sure about the concept of gender proofing the GDP. What I will say is we need to go back to basics. We need to relook at what we value and how we value it. The $0 value that we place on everything that happens in the home makes no sense, and it is only matched by the $0 value that we place on preserving our planet and our natural resources. And those two things together are what has led us to the situation that we are in today, with massive inequality, with an existential crisis with regards to the climate. So we don't value the things that sustain life. And our planet, the reproductive, productive nature of the home is what sustains societies and what sustains life. And so we need to go back to basics. We do have the frameworks, we have the SDGs, we have the tools that we need to relook at what should we value in GDP, how do we recognize and value the work that happens in the home, but also the care economy more generally. You know, so the work that happens outside the home, as teachers, as nurses, as elder care, those are disproportionately jobs that are occupied by women. And if you look at the pay scale for those jobs, they are the bottom of our economy.
Indeed. Nahla, if I can stop you just for a second, in the sense that we know this, okay? I mean, what you're saying, and we all know, those of us who are on the right side of history, if you like, and of this argument, have known this for decades and hundreds of years, in a way. What should happen, though? What do we need to see happening? Because we can diagnose the problem, but what's the solution? What do we need to see happen from the UN, for example, or governments to, if it's not gender proofing of GDP, what is it?
Yeah. So just to say, on the side of the UN, in the last month, the Prime Ministers of Canada and Jamaica, along with the Secretary General, convened a high-level meeting on financing for development in the era of COVID-19. And coming out of that, 6 work streams that we need to be looking at specifically on addressing the current context, and one of the work streams on how do we recover better. Alongside that, the Secretary General and the Deputy Secretary General actually convened last week some of the foremost thinkers, economists in the world, to be looking at the issues of debt, trade, external finance from an inclusive and sustainability framework perspective. All of the economists around the table just happen to be women. And I think this also speaks to the issue of leadership. We know that diversity, inclusion give us better responses to what we need to how we need to be responding to this crisis. And so what we need to do is we need to be having these conversations in an inclusive manner that brings all of the solutions and the diversity of solutions to the table. But it needs to be a starting point of the implementation of the SDGs on an equal footing that I think speaks to Margo's point. This is about everybody. This is a health, well-being, dignity of every individual. Indeed. And gender equality underpins that.
What we've seen with the Black Lives Matter movement and what happened in America, where we've seen it bite in terms of going from the emotional, moral, and that sense of outrage, is when company CEOs really started to say, actually, we're changing in a way that I've not seen for a very long time in previous, let's say, racial inequality scenarios. And I just wanted to turn to Margo. Margo, if we want to move this forward, what's your sense of gender proofing GDP, or you're from the Women's Economic Imperative, what do you think are some of the solutions that we should have to hand?
I think there are 3 things that I would focus on. One is, we've already talked about the measurement issue, which is critical, and it's not to be underestimated, because it means that the very measure, the design of the measures are missing out large chunks of economic contribution. So we've really got to look at that in meaningful ways. The collection of data, gender data. You cannot make policy without evidence, or good policy without evidence. You cannot make good policy without having an inclusive approach that attempts to assess the impacts and then includes accountability. So as an advisor to governments on public policy making, I am pushing very hard for us to have a much more consistent approach to making smart, gender sensitive policies by ensuring that we take an inclusive approach and we have data to support the outcomes or the targets. The third point where I think, and it's not just about the economy, but it's social dynamic as well, we need a massive investment in human capital. Mm-hmm. Making available or addressing the issues of health, education, environment, and digital access. And if we do this in a way that is equitable, then girls and women would have better access to better education, health, and other aspects of human that are required elements for human capital. The last point that I would make here in the economic space, and I think Christina Gard captured it very well. She said, women's economic empowerment is not just a moral imperative, it's an economic no-brainer. We need to get all of the constituent parties around the table on this, and it's not just government, it's private sector, civil society, Indeed. To recognize that if we can leverage this economic contribution, we grow the pie bigger, everybody gets a better slice.
Indeed. Margo and Nahla, both of you know the business case for gender equality has been there for decades. We know this is the case. What do we need to do to shift the dial significantly? Because both of you have said the things that, you know, absolutely, I totally agree with and we would agree with. But what needs to shift? What kind of international arrangement or from the existing framework or multilateral institutions do we need to see this actually move? Otherwise, we'll be having this conversation in 5 and 10 years' time. You know, what is it that needs to shift? Because there's a sense of impatience, I believe, on my part and your part, but there's a sense of outrage that actually we know what the figures are, the data is. How do we get the political will to move? What's the mechanism we need to introduce to shift the dial on gender equality? Nahla.
Great, thanks, Sandra. Let me start by echoing Margo's point. I think we need to invest in human capital, in human capabilities. And we need to do that in a way that addresses inequalities from the beginning, right through the education sphere, access to health, to housing, you know, just dismantling discriminatory laws that are in place in almost every single country in the world is a critical starting place. We need to move the care economy, as I said, into the formal economy. We need to recognize, value, and pay for the care economy in the way that we should. We need to address biases, and we need to take these head on. And I think right now, you know, you referenced the Black Lives Matter movement that we're seeing globally. We are seeing that. We are seeing the movement around gender equality, around climate change happening simultaneously. And all of these are the fractures and the weaknesses in our political, social, and economic systems that absolutely have to be addressed. And they have similar root causes to them. But I want to just speak to one specific issue, and it is linked to the economy, but it's linked to a broader issue. And you mentioned this right at the beginning, and that's the issue of violence against women.
Indeed.
Because violence is also a structural obstacle to women's meaningful participation in the public sphere, in every area of life. It's a barrier to dignity. It's a barrier to their rights. And we have seen the incredible increase in violence against women and girls in this moment in time.
Indeed.
And what is interesting is the way in which we speak about this. We speak about the rise in violence because of COVID-19. And yet the conversation that we're having right now is about the fact that the impact of COVID has in fact been disproportionately on women. So this is women who are suffering disproportionately the economic, social effects of COVID, but it is not women who are perpetrating this violence. This is male violence. And I think that this is something that both the Secretary General, the Deputy Secretary General have been very clear on. We need to shift the narrative, and we need to talk specifically about male violence. And I just want to flag for you, because we're in this forum, the UN has a partnership with the European Union, the Spotlight Initiative, the largest investment that has ever been made on ending violence against women and girls, a 500 million euro investment by the EU. It's a great platform and a great starting place for us to start to shift these issues, but it is nowhere near enough to tackle the problem that we have. And that needs to start in every country at the global level. It needs to be shifting our narrative, addressing the biases, doing the immediate of making services essential in this moment. But it has to be about tackling the root causes that allow for violence against women and girls to happen.
Indeed, I think language matters in this context, doesn't it? We don't talk about male domestic violence. We talk about domestic violence. It's almost as if it's a dirty, dirty thing to say, to name the actual nature of the problem. Margo, over to you. In terms of what do we need to do to shift the dial? Because I'm conscious of time, because I want to talk about women's leadership too. But on this point, what do we need to do to shift the dial? Is it a new multilateral institution? Is it a different kind of order of things? Over to you.
Certainly not. I think we need to shift the dial by pushing for accountability. We're in a check the box culture. We've got heads of governments, heads of corporations that have mastered the art of checking the box, and there's no real accountability. And that accountability can take different forms. It certainly, you mentioned this, the political and social roiling that we're seeing around the world. We've got to tackle it by looking at social cohesion issues and the disparities in the ownership of wealth, because really that's at the root of it. And so I think when you see we live in a world in which 2,000 billionaires control 66, the wealth equivalent to 66% of the world's population. I'm not getting that right, but you get the point. There's
Indeed.
this huge disparity, and it's a recipe for disaster ultimately. When we start looking at those things, then we can look at gender inequities and the structural and systemic inequities that encourage this or allow it to continue. We can begin to tackle things in the economic space as well. And to Nahla's point, we've also got to focus not just on changing laws, we've got to change norms and behaviors, and we've got to empower the disempowered so that they can take a rightful place at the table. It's a panoply of things that need to happen.
Indeed.
But I think there are some critical points at which we can intervene, starting with the SDGs, to be able to attack these issues.
Indeed, and I don't think many of our viewers that are watching would disagree with that, but I think they'll be scratching their heads to think, okay, what on specific terms, what really needs to happen? But I want to focus now, in the last few minutes we have, is on the role of women's leadership. We, in this century, probably have more women leaders in whether it's economics, politics, heads of state, etc., that are in a position of influence and power. Is there a role for them on this in terms of what, obviously we know, but what should their role be in terms of women's own leadership on the issue of gender inequality? Nahla.
Great, thanks, Ramendra. Yes, you're absolutely right. We have more women in positions of leadership today than we ever have had in history. And yet, what does that translate into? 10% of our heads of state and heads of government are women.
Indeed.
You know, if you look in the private sector, if you look at Fortune 500 CEOs, levels of representation of women across the board are dismal and nowhere near what they should be. The UN, this was a commitment that the Secretary General made when he took on that office in 2017. This year, for the first time in our 75-year history, we have equal gender parity in the senior levels of leadership of the United Nations. And I think that is critical. And you can see the impacts in shifting the conversations, the nature of the conversations, the responses that happen, and that has to happen across the board. Margo referenced earlier the media that we've seen covering women's leadership, heads of state of countries that are female-led, are flattening the curve faster, are on the road to recovery quicker. We are seeing the effectiveness of women's leadership, and we are seeing for the first time mainstream media profiling those women leaders, whether they be heads of state, ministers of health, private sector responses, which is great. The problem is that the mainstream media almost covers this with an undertone of surprise. And the reality is, until now, women are not in leadership positions because there is constantly this undertone of, would they be effective leaders? So now we have the proof that women are, in fact, effective leaders in this moment. They are bringing solidarity, inclusion, compassion, evidence-based policy to the table. And that is critically important. But we cannot just leave it there. We have to continue to build on this on this momentum. We need to come out of COVID with much greater levels of women's participation. And I think it's time that we actually started to talk about temporary special measures and quotas in a real way. And quotas are about dismantling the structural obstacles that we've had to women's representation in leadership. And we need to do the structural changes that are going to get us to equal participation and representation.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nahla. Margo, women's leadership, what's the role?
I think we're at a transformative point in terms of women's leadership. And Nahla alluded to the issue in making that the norm. So it should be, now we need to view this not as an exception, but as a norm. It means that we have to empower women who follow in the footsteps of these remarkable leaders so that they too can exercise their voice and their agency in this space and truly lead. So I would like to see us begin to focus and recognize that women lead from wherever they are, whether you're a mother within a household, you're a teacher or a professional, or whatever you've done. If you go through history, women have led at critical junctures and have been courageous in leading. We need to empower every little girl to do the same, and every little boy, because we teach about respect and dignity of human beings. This, I think, is what will bring us to see change ultimately for the long term.
Thank you. I think, obviously, we all know men need to own their role in structural discrimination. And actually they need to own it, not only own it, but act on it and do that in a positive way. And we've seen some examples of that, whether that's in the popular culture or the industry of pop, etc., or in films, etc. But we haven't seen that much from male political leaders. I want to end with asking you just one question. Imagine you're sitting in front of the most powerful, and they're mostly men, political leaders. What would be your one ask of them to move and shift this debate in the right direction? So I'm going to start with you, Margo, and then finish with you, Nahla.
I would ask them, because quite often they would say, especially their political leaders, is, I have the will to change. My question is, are you willing to expend your capital to change? And can I hold you accountable to that? Where is the action?
Thank you. Very well said. Nahla.
To quote Nike, just do it. This is fundamentally about political will and political power and responsibility. And as I said, the Secretary General made a commitment, and for the first time in 75 years, we have gender parity in the senior levels of the world's organization. And that shows that ultimately this is about political will and expending that political capital, as Margo said, and just the decision to do it. And we need a world where women are equally represented in all of their diversity at every decision-making table.
Thank you. Thank you both. I mean, it does feel like there's a moment of transformation for a number of reasons, not simply because the crisis has been so devastating and holistic in its impact, but the issues around climate, the issues around Black Lives Matter, the racial inequality, and what we now have is the data of the impact on women. I hope that we see, as you both say, a moment of time that's very soon, that we are able to see men, both in the public and private sphere, acting and acting with both accountability but also passion, because they actually understand it's better for society. Thank you both. It's been a fantastic conversation. We could go on for a much longer, absolutely. And I look forward to inviting you both later in the year again. Let's have this conversation again and see what kind of movement there's been in the next 5 months on this topic, whether or actually we'll just still be having the same conversation, because actually time is running out on this and we should be more impatient about it. Absolutely. So let's hope we can, join forces and have this conversation again. Thank you both.
That would be great. Thank you.
Take care. Mind your distance, and thank you very much for your time. And thank you to our viewers. Log in to Friends of Europe's website if you have any issues or questions from this discussion. Don't hesitate to tweet or send us an email. And keep an eye on our website for our next online event. Thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
It's been a pleasure.